Welcome to this session. My name is Barbara Gochalia. Today we are going to look at central banks and bank regulations. And this is our chapter overview. We shall look at the introduction. We shall look at the objectives of monetary policy. We shall look at the definition of monetary policy. We shall look at the tools or instruments of monetary policy. So monetary policy is an instrument, or it is a tool that is used by central banks, basically with a number of objectives, but with the main aim of basically regulating money supply in the economy, right? So monetary policy is simply an instrument that is used by central banks. I believe when I talk about central banks, we know central banks, right? We shall be looking at what central banks are and what their functions are later on, right? So let us look at the objectives of monetary policy. So monetary policy has a number of objectives like management of inflation, management of unemployment, and the maintenance of currency exchange rates. So one of the objectives of monetary policy is management of inflation. Now, what is inflation? With inflation, it means that we are having that an economy is experiencing persistent increase in the general price levels. With inflation, it means that the economy is experiencing persistent increase in the general price levels, right? So, which is not good because inflation itself has negative consequences, right? You know, money is good, but again, it is not in economics, it is not good to have a lot of it in circulation. One may be asking that, why is it not good to have a lot of money in circulation? Because we need this money. One would reason out and say, we need this money to make transactions. I mean, we need money everywhere. We need money to do A, B, C, D. How come that this money should not be a lot? It should not be in excess supply. And the logic is simple, is that, of course, just like you see the commodity market, where we have the quantity demanded of goods and services and the quantity supplied of goods and services. For those of us that did some economics, right? We saw that it is not good to have excess supply of goods and services, and it is also not good to have under supply of goods and services, right? Because if we have under supply, or we have a shortage of supply of certain goods and services, then it means that the prices are going to increase. The prices will definitely increase because in that perspective, the quantity demanded will be exceeding the quantity supplied. We shall not be experiencing an equilibrium in that commodity market. And similarly, if we have excess supply of goods and services, it is also not good. Why? Because if we have excess supply of these goods and services, it literally means we are having a surplus, right? We are having a surplus, and with the excess supply of these goods and services, it means that at the end of the day, the prices are going to reduce, right? If the supply increases, then the prices will reduce. Are we together? So similarly, so there it means that we must now operate at an equilibrium where we don't have where the quantity demanded is equal, the quantity demanded of goods and services is equal to the quantity supplied of goods and services. Now that is the commodity market or the goods and services market. Now, when we come to money or financial services, now that one becomes the money market. I believe some of us have heard the term money market, right? So similarly, even in the money market, when it comes to money itself, we should not have excess supply of money. And also we should not also have low supply of money. Literally, we need to operate in an equilibrium. We need to operate in an equilibrium where money supply is equal to money demand. So with inflation, inflation has a number of causes. One of its causes is that when there is excess money supply in the economy, right? When there is excess money supply in the economy and nothing is done, right? So if what happens here is that if we have excess money supply, how do you know that it's excess? When it's beyond the equilibrium. I mean, when it's not in the equilibrium. And how will you know the equilibrium? We shall get there. So if there is excess money supply, it literally means that there is a lot of money. There is a lot of money chasing a few goods. If there is a lot of money chasing a few goods, then and yet nothing is done to increase the amount, the quantities of goods and services in the economy, then what is going to happen is that the aggregate demand for goods and services, when we talk about aggregate demand, we are literally talking about that demand. It's a demand for goods and services in the entire economy or in an entire country, right? So the aggregate demand, what is going to happen is that the aggregate demand for goods and services is going to be greater than the aggregate supply for goods and services. The aggregate demand for goods and services is going to be greater than the aggregate supply for goods and services. And what is going to happen? Of course, we know that when demand is greater than supply, it means there is a shortage. And when there is a shortage, it means that prices are going to increase. The prices are just going to increase, right? So it means that here the prices have to increase. But now with this increase in the prices, if it is persistent, if there is persistent increase in the general price levels in the economy, then that's when it means we are experiencing inflation. We are experiencing inflation. I hope we are together at that level, right? So that is how the excess money supply brings about inflation in the economy. Now, of course, inflation, of course, it is not only excess money supply that leads to inflation. There are other factors as well. For example, we can have this excess money supply for example, if we have excessive expenditures, for example, by government, excessive expenditures by government, and these expenditures are not focused towards the productive ventures or productive projects or productive sectors of the economy, then it means that at the end of the day, we are also going to have excess money supply. And this excess money supply, if nothing is done to increase the goods and services available in the economy, then still the story is going to be the same. The aggregate demand for goods and services is going to be greater than the aggregate supply for goods and services. We shall have a shortage of course, those supply of goods and services, and and then the prices will increase. And if there is persistent increase in these prices, we shall be experiencing inflation, right? But also there are other factors that cause inflation. For example, we have what we call supply shock inflation, which whereby if there is a shortage of supply of basic commodities like fuel, right? If, for example, we have shortage of supply of basic commodities like fuel, like food, right? Like food commodities, they are literally we are going to experience inflation. Are we together? Prices are going to increase, because when the prices of fuel increase, then it is just automatic that the transportation fares are going to increase. And once the transportation fares increase, everything has to, the prices of goods and services have to increase, because we cannot operate business without transporting goods and services, without transporting ourselves. So that will just be definite that that we shall be experiencing inflation. So I hope now we know how this inflation, how this excessive money supply, and how these factors on the supply side of the economy lead to what we call inflation. Now, this inflation has negative effects. One of them is that it leads to devaluation of a country's currency. It leads to devaluation of a country's currency, or the country's currency will lose its value. Of course, if there is excessive, anything that is in excess, the prices will reduce. So even money, if it's in excess supply, its value will reduce, right? Its value will reduce, because we know that I think we saw in our very first lecture, I think we looked at the characteristics of money, where we saw that good money should be scarce, not scarce, but it should be relatively scarce. So in this case, the money will not be scarce because it is in excess supply. So if it is in excess supply, it's literally not relatively scarce. So at the end of the day, of course, it will be all over the place, and its value will reduce of course, in respect to other countries' currencies, right? All right. So I hope we are getting that. If there is any question, feel free to ask. Now let's come back now. Of course, now with those negative effects of inflation, of course, with inflation, when the prices are high, the standard of living of the people is going to reduce. It's not good, because people will have to use a lot of money to spend on expensive goods and services. So literally, even the cost of living will increase, but the standard of living will just be reducing, or the welfare of the people will just be reducing. So in that regard, even when the country's currency is depreciating, this is going to reduce the country's GDP, or national income, right? So with all those negative consequences of inflation, that's when the central bank comes in to regulate this money supply. And the essence would be to reduce the money supply, to bring it to an equilibrium, So one of the objectives of the monetary policy is to curb inflation levels, Secondly, the monetary policy, of course, it's done by the central bank, aims at also curbing unemployment, right? It curbs unemployment in the economy, right? So, of course, when there is, of course, with inflation, the standard of the living living of the people is going to reduce, right? is going to reduce. So when there is an unemployment in an economy, then it means that there is low economic activity. It reduces the level of economic activity. So in this regard, we are going to see how the central bank actually uses these the monetary policy instrument to deal with all this. Then thirdly, this monetary policy has an objective. Monetary policy has an objective of currency exchange, of regulating exchange rates, right? Of regulating exchange rates. Of course, we know that with the inflation, this reduces it reduces the exchange rate. Yeah, the exchange rate. It reduces the exchange rate, literally leading to loss of value or devaluation of a country's currency. So the central bank will regulate this money supply to make sure that it regulates the currency exchange rates. So let's go to the tools of the monetary policy, or the instruments of the monetary policy. So the central banks will use various, here for example, our central bank is BOU, Bank of Uganda, right? So these central banks will use this monetary policy instruments to basically regulate money supply. So let's look at the first instrument of monetary policy that is called the bank rate. That is called the bank rate, or the discount rate. The bank rate, or the discount rate. Some of you actually told me that you have done money and banking. Anyone to tell us how this bank rate monetary policy instrument works? How the central banks, it's actually called the bank rate, or the discount rate, or the CBR, the central bank rate, the discount rate, the bank rate, or you can call it the central bank rate, or the CBR, right? The CBR, or the central, which is an acronym of the central bank rate. So someone to tell us how this bank rate is used by the central bank to regulate money supply. Yes, Dennis, you actually told me that you had done money and banking, and it looked like, yes, Fiona. Yes, Fiona.
Bank rates. Do you get me? Yes.
Yes.
Bank rate is used in a way that the central bank increases the rate at which it gives out or it borrows money to the other banks or the economy or other financial institutions, in order to reduce the money supply, and in case in the money in circulation, and in case it needs the money in circulation to increase, it will reduce the bank rate or the discount, in order to allow these financial institutions to borrow more money.
You are breaking.
It can be more in the side. Hello?
Yes, you are breaking, but there is that statement. Yes, I can hear you. You had been breaking. There is that statement that you've said that the central bank does what? It borrows money.
Okay. What I said is that the central bank borrows money to financial institutions.
Borrows or lends?
lends out money to the financial institutions. So in order to decrease the amount in circulation, it will lend the money out at an increased rate, so that
in
it
order to do what?
discourages
To reduce
people.
In order to reduce, it does what?
Yes, in order to reduce the money in circulation, it will hike or increase the discount rate. And in order to allow money increase in circulation, it will reduce in order to attract people, in order to attract the financial institution to borrow more money, so that it can increase in circulation.
What is the what is the meaning of the bank rate or the discount rate?
The bank rate or the discount rate is the rate at which the central bank borrows out money.
Borrows or lends?
Lends out money. Lends out money to the financial institutions.
All right, very good, very good. So actually that is what happens. What number one is that the bank rate or the discount rate is that interest rate. It is actually an interest rate, like how you say there is an interest rate on a bank loan. So it is that interest rate at which commercial banks borrow money from the central bank. Are we together? So it is very important to know that, it is very important for us to know that the commercial banks lend money to the central bank lends money to commercial banks. Are we together? But that interest rate at which the commercial banks lend out money at which the central bank lends out money to the commercial bank is called the bank rate or the discount rate or the central bank rate, CBR. Are we together? So for every monetary policy instrument, we are going to look at two scenarios. We are going to look at a scenario where there is excess money supply, right? A scenario where there is excess what? Money supply. That's why it's called monetary policy instruments or monetary policy tools, right? Because it aims at regulating the money supply. So we have a scenario where we have excessive money supply, and number two, we have a scenario where there can be a scenario where we have low money supply, because we have already seen that it's not good for money to be in excess supply, and it is also not good for money to be to have low money supply, right? So in every scenario that could occur in an economy, here the central bank would work against that to make sure that it brings the supply of money to an equilibrium, right? So let's look at a scenario. It's good. Fiona knows what happens with the bank rate, but I want to explain to the rest of us such that we grasp the concept more, right? So what happens when there is excessive money supply? Of course, we've seen how excessive money supply brings about inflation, right? Where we shall have a persistent increase in the general price levels, right? We have seen that. So we can say that in periods of excessive money supply or during periods of inflation, what will the central bank do in order to reduce curb inflation? What it does is that it increases. Remember now, if there is excessive money supply, there is inflation. It means that now the central bank has to work towards reducing the money supply. It has to work towards reducing the money supply to bring it to an equilibrium, right? So what the central bank will do is that it will increase the CBR, the central bank rate, or the discount rate, right? And the essence of increasing, of course, now it means now that it has increased the interest rate at which commercial banks borrow from it. So literally now this one makes it difficult or harder for these, it discourages actually commercial banks from borrowing from the central bank. And when it discourages these commercial banks from borrowing from it, what will happen is that this reduces the reserves, the commercial bank reserves. It reduces the commercial bank reserves, right? The commercial bank reserves. Are we together? The commercial bank reserves, or the amount available for these commercial banks to lend out money to their borrowers, right? So of course now if it is discouraging these commercial banks to lend out money, to lend out money, of course what happens is that when these commercial bank reserves reserves reduce, then it means that these commercial banks in return, they are going to increase their interest rates. So increasing the central bank rate in the end is also going to increase the interest rates. The commercial banks are going to also now increase the interest rates that they are charging on their borrowers, on the prospective borrowers. So when these interest rates on loans are increased by these commercial banks, what do you think will happen? This discourages borrowers from borrowing money, because if the interest rates are high anyway on these loans, it discourages these people from borrowing. And of course now this will be working towards limiting the continuous increase in money supply in an economy. So practically it will help the central bank will be help in that way, curbing continuous increase in the money supply into the economy through commercial banks giving out more loans to the borrowers. So I guess we are getting the logic. Then during periods of low money supply, actually, for example, during periods of what you call a deflation. A deflation is when an economy is experiencing, it's the opposite of inflation. An economy is experiencing low prices, right? Low prices. And of course, these low prices come as a result of low money supply, because low money supply will lead to a scenario where there is low aggregate demand. There is low aggregate demand for goods and services. This will reduce the economic activity, right? This reduces the economic activity, and along the way, what happens is that now we shall experience, of course, if people are not working, we are going to have scenarios of unemployment. We are going to have what we call a recession. We are going to experience a recession, and a recession is a period characterized by high levels of unemployment, because the recession is a period characterized by low economic activity when people are not working. For example, what happened during the lockdown, right? The COVID-19 lockdown, when people were locked up, restricted movements, people were not working, so low economic activity. So practically a recession is a period of low economic activity. It is also a period of, because people will not be working, it leads to high levels of unemployment. And when high levels of unemployment do happen, then also we shall also experience high levels of inflation. So a recession is actually, we looked at the business cycles. For those of you who did the macroeconomics, right, with me, we looked at business cycles, and we saw that there is what we call a trough and there is what we call a boom. So along the trough, right, along the trough we have is where when we experience recession, and there is also what to call a boom. So that this downward area here is where we shall be, is the what you call a trough, is where we shall be experiencing the downs, the ups and downs, the ups and downs of economic activity, the downs, the trough, and it's where we shall be experiencing a recession. And the recession will be a period of high levels of unemployment, high levels of inflation, and of course low economic activity, like what happened during the lockdown, the COVID-19 lockdowns, where people were not working. So in that case, now it means there is low money supply. You remember the prices initially, because there was panic shopping, the prices increased, right? So that period, the prices had increased. There was inflation, of course, now. And then when people were locked up, that was a period of low economic activity that actually led to a recession. So the world has been facing a recession, practically the whole world, because of COVID-19 pandemic. So what happens after now? People, what actually is happening right now is that exactly that the governments, the world governments, are now boosting their economies by, of course, this, like the central bank does it. This is what exactly they are doing to boost their economies. So during the period, we are assuming that maybe after the lockdown was a period of recession. So after the lockdown, what would the central bank do? When it's using this bank rate, monetary policy instrument, what it does is that during a recession, it reduces, it does the opposite of inflation. It will reduce the central bank rate, or it will reduce the bank rate. And what would be the essence of reducing the bank rate? Of course, when it reduces that interest rate at which it lends money to commercial banks, this encourages commercial banks to borrow money from the central bank. And when they borrow, this increases the central bank reserves. And of course, now it means that when the commercial bank reserves increase, the interest rates they charge on loans will now also reduce, and this will definitely encourage borrowers to acquire loans from these commercial banks. And now when they acquire the loans, this now practically will now increase money supply in the economy. It will increase money into the circulation of money into the hands of the public, because initially we would have been experiencing low money supply or a recession. So now the central bank has reduced the central bank rate to basically now bring about increased money supply into the economy by stimulating commercial banks to increase the loans given out when it reduces the central bank rate. I believe now we know how that monetary policy instrument works at this point. The second monetary policy tool or instrument is what we call the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement, which we can also call the legal reserve requirement. The legal reserve requirement, or which you can simply call the reserve requirement, right? Anyone who remembers what the legal reserve requirement, how the central bank uses the legal reserve requirement? You have told me that you did money and banking. So now I want to really prove whether we understood what we were studying, or we were just cramming to pass, right? So anyone who remembers how the legal reserve requirement works? The legal reserve requirement works. Yes? Waligo is offline now, eh? Yes, Ian? the legal reserve requirement. Actually, some of you are telling me, Madam, we've already done money and banking and we feel like we are repeating the course. No, the other one was just a mother course to help us understand our management of financial services, because you cannot talk about management of financial services and you don't talk about money. That is out, right? So with the legal reserve requirement, what happens is that it is for what happens is that now for commercial banks, what happens is that for every deposit that commercial bank customers make, right? These customers for these commercial banks, every deposit that each client, each customer of a commercial bank makes with it, right? The central bank requires that, or demands that that deposit that these commercial banks have to deposit, they have to deposit a particular proportion or fraction. They have to deposit a particular proportion with it. Are we together? A percentage, in other words, a percentage of that deposit. For example, if it were you, you have your bank X, yeah, your bank, where you keep your money and so on. When you deposit, for example, when you deposit, let me say 100,000 shillings on your bank account, of course, with this commercial bank of yours, 100,000 shillings, maybe Ugandan shillings, right? So if the central bank sets the legal reserve requirement, or the RR, to be 10%, if, for example, the central bank sets the legal reserve requirement to be 10%, then it means that for this deposit that you have deposited with your bank, the central bank requires that this commercial bank deposits with it how much? 10,000. This commercial bank will now deposit 10,000 from your money which you have deposited. It will deposit 10,000, maybe Ugandan shillings, 10% of that deposit with the central bank. That's why it's called a legal reserve requirement, because the central bank requires the commercial bank, for every deposit of every customer that they make with it, that the commercial bank has to deposit a fraction in accordance to the proportion of the legal reserve requirement set by the central bank. So when you deposit 100,000 to your bank account, this commercial bank of yours, right, will do what? Will deposit, for example, if the legal reserve requirement is 10%, it will deposit 10% of this money which you have deposited to your bank. In this perspective, it will be 10,000. So that will be the legal reserve requirement. Are we together? So now, for every tool, of course, now we are looking at, for every tool, we are looking at two scenarios, right? We are looking at a scenario where there is excessive what? Money supply. And we are also looking at a scenario where there is low money supply. Of course, with excessive money supply, we know that at the end of the day, it will lead to inflation. So during periods of inflation, or during periods of excessive money supply, of course, now we are going to see how the legal reserve requirement, or the reserve requirement, is used by the central bank, right? So scenario number one, we are assuming the economy is experiencing inflation. What will happen is that now the government, the central bank increases the LRR. It increases the legal reserve requirement. And of course, now, if initially before the inflation came in, if the legal reserve requirement was 10%, you find that it may now increase it to 15%, literally meaning that this increases the amount, the proportion of every deposit that customers make to the commercial banks, that they have to deposit with the central bank. And the whole essence here, this reduces the commercial bank reserves. And in this case now, it will become the commercial banks, of course, now when their bank reserves reduce, they will also now increase the interest rates on loans, and this will discourage borrowers, right, from borrowing money. Of course, discouraging borrowing of money. It will be in a way curbing. It will actually be curbing excessive continuous excess supply of money into the economy. So that's what will happen with during periods of inflation, and during periods of a recession or a deflation, or periods of low money supply. The central bank will totally do the opposite. It will reduce the legal reserve requirement, and the whole essence will be that it reduces the proportion of money that commercial banks have to deposit with it for every deposit that their customers make with them. So this will actually now increase the commercial bank reserves, and it will now the commercial banks will reduce the interest rates. Of course, the logic is that whenever there is excess of supply of anything, any good or service or money, of course, now the interest rates will reduce. The interest rates on loans will reduce. This will increase. This will encourage borrowers to get loans from these commercial banks. And of course, when they get loans, this increases money supply in the economy. This increases the circulation of money into the economy, because initially the economy would have been experiencing low money supply. So now, with the central bank reducing the legal reserve requirement, this would in turn increase money supply in the economy, literally boosting the economy back again, up to, of course, a point where we shall be experiencing an equilibrium in the money market, right? So that is how the central banks use the legal reserve requirement, or the reserve, or simply the reserve requirement. All right. Then another monetary policy instrument tool is what we call the open market operation. The open market operation. Dennis, you are back. I was informed you've already done money and banking. Maybe you can throw some light about the open market operation. Open market operation, which we also abbreviate as OMO, Not OMO the detergent for washing, but simply open market operation. So Dennis, tell us about the open market operation monetary policy tool and how the central banks use it to regulate money supply. Yes. Yes, Dennis. Are you there? Yes, Ian. So we've forgotten, eh? All right.
Good evening.
Yes.
Under the open market operations,
Mm.
the government puts up securities such as treasury bills and bonds for sale. Usually they do this through the banks.
Is it
When
the
there
government
is
that puts up?
excess money supply, it issues them.
Mm.
So whenever there is excess money supply, they offer them for sale, the securities. And when there is
What is a
no
bond?
money supply,
What is a
they
bond?
purchase a bond.
Mm.
This is a debt instrument
Mm.
that is held, whose maturity is for more than a year.
And a treasury bill?
It is one whose maturity is less
It is
than
what?
a year.
Mm. So what would be the
Financial instrument
essence?
whose maturity.
So what would be the essence of the central bank selling these
In
securities
selling,
during periods of excessive money supply? What would
in
be
selling, it
the
is
logic behind it?
I think the logic would be to bring back, to pull money back from the economy to itself.
Exactly. Right? So what happens for the open markets? They are called open market operation because they involve trading of these securities. They involve selling and buying of these securities. And these securities are simply, for these securities, for example, we can have those bonds and the treasury bills. These are basically non-bank loans. They are debt instruments or they are non-bank loans that can be given. For example, it could be a corporation, it could be these private investors that are selling these debt instruments. So what happens still here is that the explanation you'll be explaining on two sides of the coin, right? So you look at a scenario where we have excess money supply, yeah, or during periods of inflation. And you also look at a scenario where we have low money supply. So if at all in any scenario, how would the central bank, and remember, it's not the government doing this, although the central bank is an agent to the government. We are going to see. So the central bank, during periods of, for example, excessive money supply, during periods of inflation, it will sell these securities, right? It will sell these securities, and during periods of and what would be the essence of selling these securities is that when you sell something, when you sell something, what happens? When I'm selling something, of course, the person I'm selling to will pay me money, isn't it? So even when the central bank is selling these securities, right? In return, the people that are buying these securities are paying it money. So of course, now the logic is that it is retrieving money from the hands of the public, right? Because initially there has been excessive money supply. So it's now when it sells and these people that are buying these securities are paying it money, it's now retrieving money from the hands of the public, literally now reducing money supply. Then during periods of low money supply or during periods of a recession, for example, or a deflation, when we are experiencing deflation is low prices, we are having low prices in an economy, right? But a recession, of course, will be a period of low economic activities, like we've seen low economic activity, high unemployment levels, and at a certain point, we shall also be experiencing inflation, like what happened, exactly what happened during the lockdowns, right? Where we are experiencing, especially the first lockdown, where there was low economic activity, people were not working, movement was restricted, people lost jobs. That was the high level of now unemployment. And on top of that, even the after the lockdown, of course, we had low prices at a certain point because people were not working. They had to lower the prices of their goods and services to survive. So that was practically a period of recession. And of course, now a recession is characterized by high unemployment levels and inflation. How does the inflation come in when, of course, now we are seeing low money supply in the initial stages and low prices? Of course, now in the long run, now we shall be experiencing inflation. Like how it happened when they lifted the lockdown. I think the first lockdown, when they released people to move now, you remember the transport fares had now doubled, right? Actually, up to now, they are doubled, right? So of course, now, for example, doubling the transport fares, now that one brings in now a period of what? Of high prices, which will now be a period of inflation. So that is a very good example of a recession, a period of recession that you've been passing through. So practically during this time after the lockdown, this is what actually the central banks do to really now curb the recession and boost back their economies, right? Jumpstart their economies. All right, so that's how the OMO works, or the open market operation. Now let's look at the expansionary versus the contractionary monetary policy. Like the name goes, that expansionary monetary policy will basically be aimed at increasing money supply in the economy. And of course, the expansionary monetary policy will come in during periods of a recession, where we are having low money supply in the economy. And with the expansionary monetary policy, it will be working, the central bank will be working towards increasing money supply in the economy. And of course, we've seen how these monetary policy instruments are used to increase money supply. We've seen that one way of increasing money supply is by reducing the legal reserve requirement, by reducing the bank rate or the discount rate, and also by using the open market operation, whereby it will, for example, be selling the securities, right? So on top of these three, there are basically three important monetary policy instrument tools, but also we can add here what we call the moral suasion. The moral suasion is also another monetary policy instrument tool. Of course, although there are three main ones that are used, but also this one, the moral suasion, can also be used. And with moral suasion, basically here, the central banks are just persuading, the central bank is just persuading the commercial banks to adhere to the good credit lending policy, right? It's just persuading these commercial banks to adhere to the good credit lending policy, because even when the central bank sets up the bank rate, sets up the legal reserve requirements, what happens is that at the end of the day, since these commercial banks are private banks, the central bank does not have a complete control over these commercial banks, because they are private entities. So at the end of the day, these commercial banks, even if the CBRI says the legal reserve requirement, they will be charging their own interest rates on loans, right? They have the freedom to charge any amount of interest rates on their loans, because they are private banks. So with here, we are going to see that these monetary policy instrument tools may not be very effective, although monetary policy has speed compared to the fiscal policy instruments. Then the what also you can add maybe selective credit control, right? Selective credit control. Selective credit control. With selective credit control here, the central bank will be now investing selective credit control. So with selective credit control, the central bank now invests in it invests money in projects that it thinks will be productive. It invests money in it does spending, or it invests in projects that are in productive projects in the economy. It invests selective credit control. It can decide maybe to lend out money to projects that it thinks that will be productive to the economy, of course, to boost the economy, right? Selective credit control. For example, it can issue loans to projects that it thinks will be able to be productive and boost the economy. But of course, it also has to be careful when it is investing this money, injecting this money into these projects. Are we together? Such that it does not make a loss or it does not miscalculate. Then with the contractionary monetary policy, like the name goes, it will be basically used. It will be basically used with an aim of reducing money supply, because it will be used. Contractionary monetary policy will be used in scenarios where we are having excess money supply, with the essence of reducing money supply. Of course, now with contractionary monetary policy, we are looking at the other side of the coin, where the government is reducing money supply. How? By using these monetary policy instrument tools. For example, with the bank rate, if it wants to use contractionary monetary policy to reduce money supply, what will it do? It will increase the bank rate, right? So that's what happens with the monetary policy tools. I've not had any questions, so I'm assuming that we are on the same page. Let's look at the functions of the central bank. So the central bank is at the peak of financial institutions in an economic system, and it is allowed, it is actually owned, it is usually owned by the government and given some functions to fulfill, right? So the central bank has a number of functions, and one of them being that it issues money. It does issue money. It prints paper money or paper currency, and it mints coins, right? It prints paper money and it mints coins, right? So it is the monopoly and it is the authority via printing money. However, we have realized that if it prints too much money, of course, too much money, we know that, and it's put into circulation, we have seen how too much money brings about inflation. Of course, yes, Ian. Yes, Ian. You're raising your hand. Yes.
I wanted to ask,
Mm.
who which country does, yes, I was asking,
Mm.
which country does the central bank use to print our money, the Ugandan shilling? I
Which
was
country?
inquiring, which country is it? Or where do we print ours from? Is it here in Uganda or?
Now that is a tricky question because all that happens, it is something that happens behind scenes. Maybe someone internally there would be able to give you that information, but I don't even think it's, I think that is confidential information, isn't it? Yes, because everything that does, that the central bank does, especially with printing money, I think it has to be confidential information, isn't it? But maybe you can do more research and find out. But what I know is that concerning printing money, concerning that should be really confidential information. Have I answered the question or not? Have I answered? But probably, probably I will not be in the right position to answer that. I wouldn't even want to deceive you. Because the personal, I believe that is confidential what? Information. That I wouldn't want to air out, especially in this class. Yes. Yes, Dennis. Yes, Dennis. Yes, Dennis. I see you're raising your hand. I see you're raising your hand and you're not talking. So it does issue out money. And secondly, it is a lender of last resort to commercial banks. A lender of last resort means that in periods when these commercial banks are almost running bankrupt, they have insufficient funds, the central bank can bail them out. It can lend them money such that they do not run bankrupt, right? So to basically increase their liquidity and they get them out of a liquidity crisis, right? So that's what we mean that it is the central bank is a lender of last resort to commercial banks. Then it is also a lender of last resort to the government, right? So much as it is we are going to also see that it's an agent to the government. It also lends to the government, right? Okay. And of course, we've seen that government borrowing is financed by selling of these securities like bonds on open market through that policy, that monetary policy instrument that we have seen as the OMO, or the open market operation. Secondly, is that the central bank also it has a role of setting a target growth, right? A target growth and also curbing unemployment, right? For example, we've seen that this unemployment, that during periods of recession, we experience high levels of unemployment. So when the bank is carrying out what we call expansionary monetary policy, where, for example, it will be reducing the interest rates on the central bank rate, reducing the interest rates on the legal reserve requirement, right? Where it is, for example, buying these securities, practically to inject money into the hands of the public to make sure that it boosts, it jumpstarts the economy in terms of increasing money supply and, of course, increasing economic activity. All right, then the central bank also operates the monetary policy. The monetary policy, which we have seen, it's the one that is that is in charge of conducting the monetary policy. Like we've already seen that it conducts the monetary policy using those monetary policy tools, right? All right, so for example, we can have a scenario of liquidity trap, right? Liquidity trap, whereby even if the central bank reduces interest rates to stimulate economic activity, it may not happen that way. So in that scenario, we are actually experiencing what we call a liquidity trap. So the central bank actually also works towards regulating money supply by, of course, ensuring that at the end of the day, we are having an equilibrium in terms of money demand and money supply. And also it ensures stability of the financial system by regulating, of course, financial derivatives, by regulating, for example, these commercial banks and other financial institutions. All right. Okay, so that's all about monetary policy. Thank you for